1. This goes back to the mid-90s. I would say 1995 plus or less 2 years. My grandma, already a widow, lived alone in her house in a small village, surrounded by hills and small mountains. As it happens, my grandma's house was in the slip of a mountain. Besides a small, partially paved road hardly wide enough for one car, the road was de facto used for my parents and uncles to drive their cars up to the house when visiting, and they would park in the road itself as there was no traffic whatsoever. So me, my sister, and our 3 cousins, all of us in age range of 8 to 13 years old, took advantage of the paved parts of the road to play football, soccer, over there, as we would spend almost 2 months of every summer at my grandma's house. Those vacations were the highlight of the year. Well, across the road from my grandma's, there was another house whose occupant, an elder man who lived alone, was a bit eccentric. His name was Pepe. Pepe would only leave the house to go shopping and take care of his garden, was a bit of a loner, and my grandma, who among us was the only one who he ever had a conversation with, had a polite but distant approach towards him. You know, the neighbor basics, good morning, whether this and that, blah blah blah, small talk. All this after 30 years living in front of each other, separated by no more than 10 meters. Hey, privacy is always to be respected. Pepe led quite a monk life that was threatened only by football and naughty kids. In the beginning, he just stared at us from one of the windows as we would play. As kids, we were actually quite comical, and we'd look at each other and roll our eyes and go, "Oh, this weirdo again, stalking us from his window." He would stay there for as long as we played ball. More than hours sometimes, with his poker face on. Never said a word to us. I do sometimes recall we would wave at him so he would feel uncomfortable over displaying such weird behavior, but he never waved back. And never left until we stopped playing ball. He was clearly pissed, and our assumption, of course, was that the ball was the problem. This situation repeated itself every day for around 2 or 3 weeks, and my grandma grew uncomfortable with us playing ball, so she repeatedly told us not to, but kids will be kids. And anytime my grandma was in the back garden or collecting apples from a nearby field of hers, we wanted football. Mistake. One evening we were there doing our thing, and Pepe had been staring at us for 20 minutes or so from his window when he suddenly disappeared. Now that was new. Not a minute passes and Pepe shows up on his big-ass porch, oriented towards my grandma's, where he had some firewood and a bunch of long sticks. He has a small knife in his hand, but we didn't notice it. The situation is still funny for us because he's there looking super upset, staring at us, distressed with his usual apron and wooden shoes on. Once more we look at each other, rolled our eyes, and contained our laughter. Football game carries on. Pepe grabs one of the long sticks and starts to sharpen it as if it was a spear. By this point I remember our faces started to change, but I guess our feeling was that he was just trying to intimidate us, and bottom line, we were not doing anything illegal by playing ball in public property. As we kids had discussed among us several times that he was being weird on purpose to scare us, none of us stopped playing. And then it happened. He left the porch, and with his super wooden shoes started to chase us with the spear pointing up front, as if he was a fucking medieval knight on a tournament but without a horse. Crew and me ran for our lives to my grandma's and locked the door, completely in shock, as my grandma came inside from the backyard after hearing our screams. As we told her what had happened, Pepe was still outside the house screaming he would set it on fire with all of us inside. My grandma calls 112, and in the meantime my father, who had gone for a jog, arrives at the house to find the neighbor screaming like a possessed man with a spear in his hand, and engages him. Now we are in the top floor of my grandma's, watching my father and Pepe screaming at each other, and eventually Pepe drops the spear. The police arrive and we file a report. Then they go and talk to Pepe for a while. As one of the policemen told us later, Pepe wanted to sue us for playing ball in the street by his house, and thus threatening his property with damage. It seems that the police warned Pepe he wouldn't sleep at his place if they ever had to come back. But after he threatened to burn my grandma's house with us all inside, no one slept that night. We never again played ball around there, and a couple years later, Pepe left the house to live with a relative across the country, as my grandma would find out later. You know the drill. Beware your odd neighbors, and Pepe, let's not meet. 2. This happened about 5 years ago when I was 19 in college. Class had ended, and I was studying in the library working on a report. I noticed the time, which was close to 7 p.m., and the sky was in the twilight type of lighting, so I decided that I should start heading over to the building that I usually got picked up at, and wait in the multi-faith room where sometimes I'd see friends. This room happened to be all the way on the other side of campus on the 3rd floor. As I was about 2 buildings away from the last building, I noticed that the halls were empty as most classes were done by that time for that building, but I thought nothing of it. I then heard some guys behind me and I looked back just to see who it was, just 2 men, probably around the same age or a few years older, speaking in their own language. As I made my way through the building, I felt like they were following me for a while. I thought I was being paranoid and dumb, so I stopped at a poster board and pretended to read something. The men walked up and stopped behind me, and I guess pretended to read as well. I immediately started walking towards the second last building because some feeling in my gut told me to. I walked through the doors leading to the outside of my last building, and I looked behind me and there was no one. I remember thinking to myself, wow, you are paranoid. I then entered the last building and looked behind me again. There I saw one of the 2 guys from earlier rushing to open the doors. I don't know why, but I knew he was after me. I made my way into the last building and thought of 2 ways I could make it to the room. First option, down a long-ass hallway with no seating areas, no witnesses, and longer route to the room, or down a similar long hallway with access to a staircase that led straight to the room, 3rd floor. Also no witnesses. I went with the latter. I ran down the hallway and pushed open the staircase door and looked behind me. No one was there. I decided to still run up the stairs just in case. As I was on the first flight of stairs, I heard the stairwell door bang open, and followed by footsteps stomping up the stairs. By this point I was so out of breath and my mind was hyperventilating to the max, thinking about how this is how I will die. I only had 5 steps before the end of the last floor when the guy called out to me. Excuse me, excuse me." I stopped at the break in the stairs because if I wanted, I knew my legs would give in. "Yes?" panting heavily and bending over, dying for air. "Why are you running?" He's also panting heavily and bending over, dying for air. I turned towards the stairs to make another break for it, but he came kinda in between, cornering me, and I stopped because I was too scared he would do something. "What do you want? Do I know you?" The guy then proceeded to ask for all my social media, to which I claimed I didn't have any. And then he asked for my number, to which I said no, I have a boyfriend. I remember him saying that, "Do you live with him?" To which I said no, and then he responded, "Then what's the problem?" I kept saying no to all his questions, and he was obviously getting frustrated. I then pointed to my phone and said I had to meet someone, so I had to go. He then said okay and backed off. I started inching away, and then he asked for my name. I gave him a wrong pronunciation of it, don't know why younger me didn't just lie. And then he told me his name was Harry. As he made his way down the stairs, he called out, "Oh, P, I think you're really pretty." After that, I ran out of the staircase and went into the room. One of my male friends was there and I told him what happened. He later dropped me off to where my sister picked me up. When I told her what happened, she freaked out and wanted to report it. I didn't want my parents to find out at the time, so I told her no. I saw Harry once after that, about 2 weeks later in the crowded area. He tried to say hi, but I looked the other way and pretended not to notice. Thankfully, I had no more encounters like that. And I'm so thankful nothing bad happened to me other than realizing that if I worked out more, I would have been able to run up 3 flights of stairs. To the creep who chases girls for their info, let's not meet again. 3. 2.5 years ago, I was what you might call the right hand for my boss, who owned the motel that I worked for, technically as head housekeeper. But I had recently begun training to run the full spectrum of the motel, including all things, office and front desk, overseeing staff and minor maintenance, so that my boss could take a vacation. It was a 42-room mom-and-pop place set back off the road, so it was pretty peaceful for the most part. There were still a few motley ones every now and then, but That says any motel in small-town USA. But as intimidating as the new responsibility sounded, with only 2 other staff members to worry about, it was a cakewalk. The day comes for the boss to take her leave, and I'm now in charge of her life's blood, sweat, and tears, and pumped for the opportunity to show what I was made of. She left Friday morning, and the rest of the day ran like clockwork, until around 8:30 that night. I also lived on the property in an apartment which allowed me to run back and forth to the office for guest check-ins and any office duties I needed to tend to. So when the ring the doorbell alerted, I looked at my phone and saw an older gentleman, early 60s maybe, staring through the door looking for an attendant. I spoke through the camera to let him know I'd be there in 30 seconds and started on my way to the office. As I would with any guest, while checking them in, I made small talk about his trip and gave him the lowdown on where good food in town was. I got him squared away in the computer and showed him how to get to his room, as he was getting his credit card situated back in his wallet. I thanked him for staying with us and called him Mr. Logan. He looked up at me, smiled, and said I should call him Joe, and made his way out of the office. Less than 30 minutes had passed, and I get a call from room 135, Joe's room. He proceeds to tell me that he would like to use the desk lamp, but there is no light bulb in it, and could he please get one, which immediately threw up a red flag, because I had cleaned that room myself and made it a habit to check every light bulb in the room, and know for a fact the light bulb was there, because I used the desk lamp as I was cleaning. I told him I would bring one down, and he immediately said he would rather come to the office to get it. The office was attached to an apartment-type space that my boss lived in during the week, and it was very dark in the back and set up in a way that would have made it very difficult, if not impossible, to see through the door to the apartment. Considering I was the only employee on the property, having him come to my very secluded office in the dark wasn't going to happen. I felt more comfortable taking it to his room. This was an old drive-up style setup, where I knew there would be other guests around that area that were sitting outside and could help me if I needed it. So when he says he would rather come to the office, I told him I would have to bring it to him because my boss would kill me if I made a guest change a light bulb. He says he understands, and I breathe a little easier. He's not going to get me cornered in my secluded office to do God knows what. I grab the light bulb, and before I can get to the front door, I look, and there he is looking through the glass in the door, staring me down in the most unsettling way. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I physically started shaking. I opened the door and just said, "Let's get your lamp working," and started walking past him. He then says he thinks he forgot to sign his credit card receipt, and we can go double-check. I tell him I already dropped the receipt, but I would check in the morning, and get it from him if I needed it. That was total crap. He made a big deal about finding his good pen to sign it with. We both knew he signed it. With that rejected idea, we continued to his room. As I walked in, I kicked the doorstop wedge that I brought with me under the door so it couldn't close without assistance. And had he tried, I would have had time to yell for help from the guys next door to him. I think he figured that out and moved away from the door. As I put the bulb in the lamp and turned to leave, I noticed the original light bulb halfway sticking out from under the couch pillow. I picked up my pace, chose to say nothing, and left. I made sure he didn't see where I went because I sure didn't want him to know that I lived there or which apartment was mine. 30 minutes later, and the phone rings again. Of course it's Joe. This time he would like extra coffee for in the morning. I tell him that I'm unable to get into the housekeeping supply room because the housekeeper accidentally took the key home. Total lie, but I wasn't going back over there. He had me legitimately scared. He called 2 more times that night, but I changed my voicemail to the motel's information and let him leave a message. I never even checked them. Bad customer service for my first night running the place alone, but I really didn't think my boss would entertain the idea of penalizing me after she heard the whole story. The next morning starts out quite as usual. I was running audit when Joe shows up at the door. I wasn't scared this time because one of my housekeepers was getting coffee in the kitchen, and I had people coming and going checking out. Joe asks me to go to breakfast with him. I explain that I'm on the clock and have a business to keep afloat for my boss. But thank you for the offer. I'm not sure exactly what went down in this next 2 hours because I was working, but somewhere in there Joe's car quit working. He was trying to go to the next town over, which is significantly bigger than my town, for one reason or another. Anyway, he starts getting unreasonably angry that his car won't start, saying things like, "How am I supposed to do this without a fucking car?" and whatnot. Then it dawns on him that there is a car dealership next door, and he starts off in that direction. But before he gets too far away, he sees me coming out of a room and says, "You're gonna marry me, just wait and see. We're going to Vegas." All with smiling and chuckling. So I chuckled too, because there's no way he's being serious. I hoped. I continued on with my day. About 5 hours passes, and I get a phone call from the dealership asking if Mr. Logan had checked out. I said he was booked for one more night, and he proceeds to tell me that Joe took a car for a test drive and was supposed to return in 30 minutes, but hadn't returned and is not answering phone calls. They asked if I could check his room to see if his belongings were still there. I obliged. I opened his door after knocking with no response, and found the room completely destroyed, papers all over the place, trash on the floor, pictures off the wall, the whole nine. But I wasn't sure if the papers were something he'd come back for, so I bailed and just left that stuff behind. Aside from the papers, the only other personal belongings were a pair of swim trunks and a pair of socks. Again, was that worth coming back for? So I tell the dealership that I'm not 100% sure he's coming back, and they call the police. After another couple of hours, the police show up at the motel, Joe in tow. I had decided, since he paid up until the next day, I would just leave his stuff in there in case he returned, which I honestly didn't think would happen. He goes in and starts taking his things out of the room. That's when the cop comes up to me, and being a small town, knows me and pulls me aside. He says, "Chaotica, you need to thank God for every night that you're still alive and well here." I said, "Okay, but what makes you say that?" "That man had every intention of taking you with him tonight and going somewhere you'd never be looked for in. I don't know that he would have let you live. He's a sick man. We're taking him for a psych eval and then to the county if he's okay for general population." He then says that I should call my boss and let her know what was happening, and maybe take my own vacation for a few days, just in case they can't make the car thing stick, since the dealership no longer wanted to press charges given his psychological state. And that was technically the only law he broke. They also said they would patrol the motel every hour or so to check on me if he is released. I was completely taken aback by this whole ordeal, and to this day wonder how he planned on getting me out of there, and what he was going to do if he did. He was released after 24 hours, but I never saw him again, and I'm okay with that. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 495. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use and sent in stories for use in this video. Also, thank you very much to those keeping me company on the live stream as I record. I would have done one on the Sunday, but I had an attack of the sleepies on Sunday. I'm not quite sure what caused it, but I was very, very tired, even though I got up late. Which was probably the reason, because I'd went to bed much later on Saturday. I was up later than I should have been. And that kind of stupid being up late, the kind of where you're not really doing anything, you're just too lazy to move and actually go to bed. That's just not healthy. I need to stop doing that. So anyway, I went to bed late, which meant I got up late, and I did get stuff done on Sunday, so it's not like it was a completely unproductive day. I did finally get out into the front garden, and I gave the grass a cut. It was a little project, Blu-ray project I was working on as well, got some work done with that. So I also figured out I had, let's just say, an incident with my external Blu-ray drive that involved it not working properly and a repeated introduction to my foot. So that left me without well, it was barely working anyway, but it left me without a working Blu-ray drive. Because the computer I've got right now, the tower, doesn't have a slot for an internal one. But I had a good internal one that I was going to put in it, and I thought, hang on a minute. Can I just snake the cables outside the case and just rest it on top of something? Turns out, yep, can. And not only can I do that, but that works much, much better than the one I had installed. It's a lot faster because it's connected to the computer instead of, it's connected via SATA cable instead of the USB. And I'm really just yammering on a bit nonsense now, aren't I? But anyway, that that ultimately worked out. I got to use the drive I'd wanted to use all along, and I didn't even have to buy an enclosure for it. Okay, I'm going to wrap things up there and head off to the next video. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.